All right, go live.
Welcome to the Nullcon Webcast. So this is slightly different than our traditional webinar. We'll be discussing about the log4 shell vulnerability, which came in like a storm with a 10 on 10 CVSS and direct remote code execution. We'll be discussing its impact, learnings, and how to defend upon the similar lines of exploits in 2022. We have Alvaro and Joe here to discuss on this topic. A few words describing Alvaro and Joe. So Alvaro Munoz is working for GitHub Security. He's working as a principal security researcher with GitHub Security team. And before joining the research organization, he worked as an application security consultant, helping top enterprises to deploy their application security programs. Passionate about web application security, where he's focused most of his research work and presented in prestigious conferences like Black Hat, DEF CON, RSA, etc. And holds several certifications, including OSCP, GWP, CISSP. Talking a bit about Joe. So Joe Slowik works for Kikamon. He's leading 2 verticals there and has over 10 years of experience in information security. He has served under multiple roles in US government to several positions in the commercial sector. Joe has worked extensively with offensive security to incident response, covering the whole spectrum, and right now he's leading the threat intel team. Myself, I work with FAR2, and I'm working as a security consultant for more than 4 years. So Alvaro himself is kind of the authority on JNDI injections, given he has presented a talk in Black Hat on the same. So I'd like to open this webcast by asking Alvaro, what drove you towards that research? Reason being that research you conducted very closely resembles what happened now, and the research itself was published in 2016. So we have had a good buffer of 4, 5, 6 years to act on it, and still we did not. So Alvaro, over to you.
Yeah, so thank you, and thank you for having me here. So back to 2016, well, at that year we were researching and looking for interesting new vectors to get arbitrary code execution in Java environments. And I remember reading a blog post by Trend Micro, and this blog post was talking about some malware samples that were found, and they were targeting the NATO and the White House actually, and they were exploiting the Java applets. I don't know if you remember the Java applets that used to run on the browser, but at that time they had a history of vulnerabilities, and what they did to protect against some of them was to enable the click to play or click for play or something like that. So you had to actually click on the applet to enable that. And this malware found a way of bypassing this protection, this click to play protection, by running some code before this protection was actually enabled, right? So what they found is a way of instantiating an arbitrary Java class, and what they did in the exploit, in the actual malware, is instantiating the JavaX naming initial context, which is the main class for the JNDI package in the Java package. So basically what they were doing was they were initializing this context, and they were bringing some JNDI properties from their own server, and then they were using RMI to bring an object and then instantiate the payload and run the payload. So that was very interesting. It was an RMI vector that was being used explicitly. It's not like they found some vulnerable JNDI lookup in the applet code. They were using JNDI as part of the exploit, right? So as part of the payload, if you want to put it this way. So both Alexander Miros, which was my colleague at that point in 45, we started looking at JNDI more depth. We wanted to know how that was possible, and if there were other vectors, and if current or regular applications could become vulnerable because somehow untrusted data was flowing to these APIs. So we did that. We found about not just the RMI vectors, but also the LDAP ones, the Corba ones, the IIOP ones, the Java, the LDAP poisoning vectors, etc., that we presented in 2016 at Black Hat. And then, well, I guess that the talk was not well. It was very well received by the security researcher community, and actually the JNDI vector was used largely in different deserialization chains. So it was basically, this research was basically used and leveraged for deserialization attacks. But if you think about applications that were vulnerable to JNDI injections, we presented a couple of them at Black Hat talk, like I think they were from Oracle, like TopLink and another one, one for example in the Spring framework. But then from 2016 to now, there were like very few, maybe 10, 20 applications that were vulnerable to JNDI injection. So it was not like a very prevalent or popular kind of injection. And I guess that explains why it was not, why did it flow under the radar of many developers, right? So it was not like SQL injection or cross-site scripting that every developer knows about. It was less known, and probably that's the reason why JNDI, log4j maintainers didn't know about this one. So, yeah. So also, I think that it's important that Oracle fixes this RMI vector in like probably 2016. That was the year where they disabled being able to load these remote classes from a remote code base and then initializing them in your code. But then they left LDAP vector open for a couple of years until they fix it. So that would be like 2018. But then they never fixed the deserialization vector in the LDAP protocol. So we reported that, but it was never fixed. So it was always possible to get a remote code execution if you found the required gadgets in the class path, so through these deserialization attacks. And also, I think that to complete the timeline, I think we also have to mention Mikhail research Artsploit from Veracode, who found another or different vector to get remote code execution under some limited scenarios, like for example, having some classes in the class path, or for example, having the application running on top of Tomcat, etc. So I think that are all the relevant steps before we go to December of 2021, where we had this log4j explosion.
Right, and so let's touch a bit upon what happened starting November 24. That is when the security researcher notified about this vulnerability. According to you, how did the event unfold as you experienced?
So now we're talking about 2014, right? So JNDI attack vectors were not known at all. So I can't blame any developers by enabling something that could connect or make a JNDI connection to a user provide server. Well, if you think about it, that was little they know about the risk that connection posed. But if you think about, well, even if they don't know about RC, they were aware that because actually the code is checking that if whatever follows the JNDI colon prefix contains another colon, then they are going to treat it like an absolute URL, and then they are going to make an outbound connection. So they were very aware that outbound connections could be done and that they could be controlled by anyone that were able to inject those strings, those payloads into a log message. So I think that's all boils down to having a security mindset as a developer, trying to think how the features that you're implementing can be abused. And in this case, even if you don't know anything about the potential of getting remote code execution, you shouldn't let anyone connect to an arbitrary server from your server, from your if you don't really need it, right? So you should go implement a low list. You should implement some controls that don't allow anyone to connect to any arbitrary server.
And Joe, coming to you, so what was your observation? What happened in 2021 December, November end? The chaos, the panic, the confusion, and basically this time every mainstream media company also covering log4j. So what was your observation around this?
Right. And it took a little bit for people to start understanding the potential scope of this event, especially from a more general media perspective. So if you look from late November when the initial disclosure took place to the log4j, to Apache, and then onto the log4j maintainers who are doing this essentially out of the kindness of their heart, and we should be very thankful to them for maintaining this code base because it's open source software. But then things got interesting because the public disclosure took place on the 10th of December. And as people began looking at this, not only did it become quite clear that this was maybe not trivial, but at least relatively easy to exploit, but also as security vendors began looking in telemetry, as various parties began investigating, it started to look as though there were entities that were actively using this attack path starting potentially as early as the 1st of December. So that's a mystery that still hasn't been solved as to how this information may have gotten out. There were tweets from representatives from Cloudflare and a couple of other organizations that said that they spotted exploitation in the wild prior to the public disclosure. So that was interesting. But then from the 13th on, things sort of mushroomed because looking at the vulnerability itself, looking at the patch and how precisely to trigger this condition, we're talking about passing a string into a web request or into some sort of traffic that would get picked up by a log4j enabled device. And there were multiple ways of doing this. In fact, if you were checking social media from the 13th of December for the next couple of weeks onward, you could probably find some offensive security researcher posting a new variation or a new way of fuzzing the exploit string hourly, if not daily, in that time period, which made this a really complex item for the security community to begin tracking down, to differentiate between researchers and scanners that were just trying to determine the scope and applicability of this vulnerability compared to actual malicious actors that were out there, which is why things got a little fuzzy. That while there were those isolated examples of pre-disclosure exploitation, things really started to pick up from the 14th of December onward, where vendors started to identify some opportunistic attempts to install things like crypto miners, some potential advanced persistent threat APT usage of this exploit in tandem with other behaviors associated with those groups, and then sort of expanding from there. It has been kind of weird though, and there's been some discussion around this both in things like the US Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency held a press conference yesterday or 2 days ago. Can't remember exactly when. It was this week, addressing log4j, at least from the context of the US federal government, that, hey, we haven't seen this in any intrusions in our networks. Like, one, they say they haven't seen it, doesn't mean it hasn't happened. So there's always that caveat, but also gets to, there was lots of concern that this would be a really big deal. You had some people saying that this could be wormable. I would disagree with that, although I'm not an exploit writer. So, certainly, Alvaro, if you have some comments on that, I'd be really curious to hear them. But we haven't seen this sort of widespread MS-1710, the WannaCry vulnerability-like impact to this just yet, which has been kind of interesting. So although we still, like from my own organization's perspective, we see lots of network traffic related to entities trying to exploit this, most of the activity so far has been things like crypto miner or web shell installation or very sort of direct attack pathways. So it'll be curious as attackers and actual adversaries understand more and more about how this vulnerability is leveraged and where the vulnerability resides in networks, if we start seeing some more complex and refined ways of trying to target it as well.
Fair enough. So do you see the trend at least dying or coming to a plateau, or is that this trend in traffic is still increasing and new variations are coming up?
So for what I could see personally, and from talking with other researchers at other companies with different visibility, it seems like things have been ebbing and flowing, or coming and going over time. That certainly there was a huge spike initially with, all sorts of platforms trying to scan this. And then it seemed over the holiday period that things decreased a little bit and then picked up again afterwards. And then it seems like there's significant variation on a day-to-day basis, whether it's someone spins up a new virtual private server somewhere and decides, oh, I'm going to start installing a Mirai variant wherever I can to build out my botnet or whatever. And then that goes away after a couple of days and network traffic dies down again. So it's been highly variable and hasn't mapped very neatly into something like see an initial spike and then a long tail tapering off as entities move on to different sort of attack paths or different sorts of behaviors.
Do you have kind of any specific predictions as such using experience of what's going to be the implication, the long-term implication of this, at least in the coming year?
Well, one of the things, and I've blogged about this through Gigamon as well as personally, is there was a lot of pressure on a number of organizations to patch this immediately. And that's good, especially the 2.15 and the 2.16 patches, which are very important in addressing the remote code execution vulnerability in a sort of default setting. But the real concern I have is that there is a number of software dependencies, a number of ways, just as we saw going back to something like the SolarWinds Orion event from 2 years ago now, where yes, you have this vulnerable software package in an application, but then you don't realize that that application is actually bundled with and used in conjunction with some other third-party software that you're using. So an organization may have done a very good job of patching all of its own known instances of using log4j, but knowing that some other piece of software, including things like security tools, monitoring tools, data aggregation tools, or whatever that rely on processing, making things, logging more accessible and whatnot that would use this library, may integrate this, and people might not be completely aware of that just yet. So that will get us into a patching cycle where you're relying not just on your own internal team's efforts to patch this specific vulnerability, but whatever your third-party software suppliers that are also integrating this into their products to do the same. And we've seen this with the industrial control system space already, where a number of vendors, major vendors, have been working very diligently, but not completing the research into this just yet, of both trying to identify where in their code bases they may have referenced and used log4j, potentially going back into very old versions of the log4j library in their applications, and then going through the work of trying to determine, like, okay, can we patch this? What does this look like in terms of functionality? Do we break anything? And I would expect we'll see vendor patches for this over the next several months, as opposed to just that initial sprint that we saw before the Christmas holidays of organizations trying to patch this on-prem.
Right. At this point, we have a question from YouTube, I believe. And the question is, can this be stopped with AI? It's kind of a vague question, but maybe we can rephrase it as AI in terms of, let's say, security appliances, such. So basically, let's discuss what are things that could have been done to detect and mitigate these without knowing the exact thing. Reason being, we already discussed that Twitter and other social media were overflowing with offensive security researchers posting variations, so that a simple rule to block such traffic or detect such traffic will not work. So what kind of scope do we have in terms of AI coming in to deal with such variations of the attack?
Interesting.
Right.
Alvaro, do you have thoughts on that? Or
well, I'm not really any expert on AI, and I guess that if we are talking about detecting the patterns of the exploit of the payload, we'll have obviously the simple one, that is the JNDI colon whatever strings, which are very easily detected. And then when we start fussing with the different ways that nested resolutions allows you to create complex chains, I guess that there is room for AI to actually cluster these an incoming request into a potential payload for log4shell or not, because, well, it has a very specific characteristics, right? So probably because of this fuzzing, the payloads are going to be huge. There are going to be some characters that are always going to be there, like the dollar, curly brackets, etc. So I guess that, as I said, I don't know about AI. I'm not an expert on that, but I think that it's possible to use it to cluster incoming requests and try to detect if there is an attack or not. I don't know if WAF vendors are doing that or not. I'm not familiar with the current techniques, but yeah, I think there is room for it.
Yeah, I think there's certainly possibilities as well. I would stretch this a little bit further, that even from an artificial intelligence perspective, trying to capture the initial exploit string, I think, as the person asking the question noted, is a losing game, because there are near infinite ways of obfuscating, encoding, encrypting, or other ways of trying to pass the payload onwards. But things get more interesting if we look at follow-on actions as part of the exploit pathway of sending the attack string to a vulnerable device and then following that up with a external LDAP lookup, or following it up with some other network traffic to a device. And maybe artificial intelligence or some way of performing traffic and device type classification could be very valuable, such as, why do I have a server in my network, something I've classified as being a server type device, initiating an external LDAP connection to an unknown host? Being able to identify those items, whether through machine learning, artificial intelligence, or through some more behavioral classification, is a really powerful way to start identifying traffic streams of interest that could relate to not just log4j related activity, but also identify other attacks as well. And I think that's that's what my team has been doing for the last couple of weeks in trying to address this and other vulnerabilities, is going for, how do we address the attacker life cycle of trying to use any vulnerability as an initial access and code execution mechanism, and what are those sort of attacker dependencies that exist in trying to take advantage of them?
Yeah, I think that you mentioned something very important, because we were talking about why developers were allowing outbound connections from their library, but the real question is why big companies and large enterprises are allowing outbound connection to any arbitrary server in the internet. I'm talking about Apple's, Microsoft's, any company that have been affected, is because from their own networks, you can initiate connections to any arbitrary server. And that's a little bit concerning. So yeah, developers should take their part and try to prevent that kind of issues. But there is also a lot of things to improve in network security from big companies and a smaller one, of course.
Right. So given the situation, we also have one more question, that is, how was this vulnerability discovered? I'm not sure if we are in the position to answer this. How much reward did this person get? And the other aspect is, we can answer this, and probably, as you mentioned, that the library itself is maintained by volunteers, so they fixed it out of their kindness. So from what I believe, neither the person who reported it got any monetary benefits, nor the team who fixed it got it, but the entire security community around security products, bug bounty, they made a lot of money, and there are a lot of financial implications involved, right?
Actually, something that I wanted to highlight here is that the reporter, which one of them, because I think it was a team within the Alibaba company, right. Actually is one of the persons that I have been finding JNDI injections all of these years since 2016. They were talking about another one in the H2 database, like, for example, they reported that last year. But one thing that I wanted to highlight is not just that he didn't get any money, like a bug bounty from log4j, Apache, or the bug bounty program for internet, but also because they reported it immediately to Apache security team and the log4j team, they got some kind of ban from the Chinese government, which was very brave from them, because otherwise, if this kind of exploit end up in some nation agency or nation state agent or something like that, that could have been very, very bad for the security of the internet. So I'm very glad and happy that they decided to report it, and even though they took nothing out of that, except for some problems with their own local government. So
right. Along these lines, I think the NHS detected an threat actor using this to hack their VMware Horizon servers and plant web shells. So, but it's right that what they did is good, and that minimized the damage a lot. But even then, there were some instances. I think Joe mentioned that before December 10th, there are still some instances of this vulnerability being used even before it was publicly released. So, yeah, that's that.
Which is, sorry, didn't mean to cut you off.
No. Yeah, that was the end of my sentence.
Oh, and so that is an interesting bit. That still, we don't have a lot of information about that activity just yet, other than vendors saying that, oh, we've identified instances of this. So having some more information about that would be very good to try to figure out just how that might have happened, or who might have been using this, and how that information may have been spread around. Because, like Alvaro was saying, this could have been significantly, maybe not worse, but certainly less ideal in terms of disclosure, especially given the political pressures where this research was originally performed, and how those disclosures are, I guess, supposed to take place, that they get sent to a government authority before being disclosed onto the actual vendor or maintainers and whatnot, which opens up all sorts of potential for possible abuse or other things. So this is all conjecture. I have no idea actually, but we could certainly think of scenarios. But yeah, it was if you think about it in terms of timeliness, with the disclosure to Apache in late November and then a patch following, a couple of weeks later, that's a pretty good turnaround for identifying a pretty severe vulnerability and then getting it patched into the project, and this being done as an open source project maintained by volunteers. Major software companies should aspire to have that level of responsiveness to this sort of activity. So, while they had to revise things slightly in order to disable the JNDI functionality as a default in the 2.16 patch, overall, the log4j maintainers, I think, did a pretty good job with respect to all of this, given circumstances.
Right. And so this is one such incident, but Alvaro, next in the final discussion list, do you see any trend of in the coming year more of this kind of vulnerabilities will be discovered in other languages and libraries? And what are the challenges that large orgs faced this time for patching and fixing it on time? And what is it that they should be doing to, if not prevent, then be very proactive and very fast about mitigating these in the coming years? Because I think we are seeing a trend here where this class of vulnerability, which almost impacts everybody, these have been coming on for a while now, and I think in future the rate will only increase. It's very important that the organizations have maybe a QRT or some sort of response team which is just responsible for actively monitoring and patching this kind of situation.
Yeah, so first of all, I don't think that we are going to see a trend of JNDI injections in the following months or years. As I said before, we presented this talk at 2016, and since then, it's only been like a handful of similar vulnerabilities being found. So it's not very common that you pass untrusted data into a JNDI lookup. That's something normal to take or to look up values from configuration files or things like that, but not really from untrusted data or user control data. So I'm not expecting a huge spike on JNDI injections, like people or researchers are going to start looking for JNDI injection now, and they are going to start popping up from anywhere. So that's fine. And I'm also optimistic in that I think that people or companies have been very proactively patching this vulnerability. So from GitHub, for example, we have sent more than 500,000 dependabot, which is a software composition analysis tool. So basically tells you if your dependencies or the dependencies of your dependencies are actually using an insecure version. And we have been notifying more than 500,000 maintainers. And out of the active one, because GitHub is obviously full of active and a lot of non-active projects, but around 50% patched the log4j vulnerability within the first 7 days. So now we are in January 13. I guess that this number is quite larger now. And that's what made me optimistic. This is open source. And I guess that the large companies are doing the same thing privately. So yeah, of course, there are going to be a lot of applications that are going to remain vulnerable because either they are legacy and cannot be changed, or because they are unmaintained and no one is actually touching them anymore, or because, I don't know, you are using some third-party software in your company that you are not keeping up to date, or because it's not being actively maintained and you need to use it because moving to a different software would be very costly. And things like that are going to keep Log4Shell alive for at least, I would say, a couple of years. But yeah, the impact, the long tail is going to be very low, I think. I want to be optimistic, at least.
Right.
I don't know if Joe has maybe a different opinion.
I agree that given the nested nature of where this software package resides, as well as, like you were saying, not just direct dependencies, but dependencies of dependencies, and then getting into high availability, fairly complex production systems like a data historian in a industrial environment, or a business process server or service in a financial services environment, that, you know, and a lot of times you're talking about systems that don't get patched very frequently or rely on older software payloads that don't get taken care of very often. And these are very sensitive sort of items that certainly they're not, hopefully they're not directly exposed to the internet. That would be terrible. But once an adversary is able to get within a network, this may provide a route to get at certain high value systems. And it'll take some time, not just for these sorts of dependencies to get unraveled and then addressed, but then for organizations to find the time to perform both the acceptance and regression testing to make sure that they don't break anything in their environment, and then to actually apply these moving forward to make sure that these sort of security holes are removed. So certainly, you know, from a external facing initial access perspective, I would say that this will probably get addressed over the next couple of months and be reduced fairly dramatically as a initial access vector. But for internal lateral movement or exploiting services once inside a network, this will be a problem for the foreseeable future for those reasons.
Yeah, right. So thanks, Alvaro. Thanks, Joe. I really enjoyed discussing with you guys. It was really nice to have you here. I had some interesting insights, and hopefully, Alvaro, your optimism plays out as expected. Yeah, that's all.
Thank you. And thank you for having us here.
Yep, lots of fun.